You lose. Everything you built is gone.
The rich girl framed the maid for stealing and watched her go to prison. She thought the maid's life was over, but 12 years later, she would regret everything. In the beginning, Sora never imagined her life would turn into a story about revenge. When she first arrived in Seoul, she was just a quiet 20-year-old girl with a worn backpack and a pair of shoes that had already begun to tear at the sides. The city lights dazzled most newcomers, but to Sora, they felt cold and distant, like stars that belonged to someone else's sky. 3 months earlier, she had still been living in a small coastal town with her parents. Her father repaired fishing nets for a living, and her mother ran a tiny stall selling noodles near the harbor. They were never rich, but every evening they ate dinner together, laughing about small things. Then, one night, everything disappeared. Her parents were driving home from the market when a truck lost control on the highway. By the time Sora reached the hospital, both of them were gone. In the span of a single day, her world collapsed. There was no family left to take her in. The small house they lived in had to be sold to cover debts, and so Sora did the only thing she could think of. She packed her belongings into one bag and boarded a bus to Seoul. At first, she believed the city would give her a chance, but Seoul was not kind to people like her. For weeks, she searched for work. She walked from one restaurant to another asking if they needed dishwashers. She applied at convenience stores and cleaning companies. Most places rejected her immediately. Sometimes they didn't even look up from their phones when they said no. Money disappeared quickly. Within a month, she couldn't afford rent anymore. There were nights she slept on a bench near a subway station, pulling her thin jacket tight around her body as the cold wind slipped through the underground corridors. Other nights, she sat inside a convenience store pretending to read magazines until morning because she was too afraid to sleep outside. Hunger became something she learned to ignore. One evening, after 3 days of eating nothing but cheap bread, Sara sat quietly on the steps of an office building and wondered if coming to Seoul had been a mistake. And that was when an unexpected opportunity appeared. A middle-aged woman in a neat uniform stopped in front of her. "You look like you need work," the woman said bluntly. Sara quickly stood up and bowed. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do anything." The woman studied her face for a moment before nodding. "My name is Mrs. Han. I manage household staff for the Park family in Gangnam. We need another maid." Sara felt a surge of hope, so strong it almost hurt. The Park family was one of the wealthiest families in the city. Their company owned shipping lines, luxury hotels, and several real estate developments across Korea. Working for them meant stability. Food, shelter, a real paycheck. Sara bowed deeply. "Thank you. I promise I'll work hard." Mrs. Han looked at her seriously. "Working there isn't easy. The daughter is difficult." Sara didn't hesitate. "I can handle difficult." At that moment, she had no idea how wrong she was. The Park mansion stood like a palace in the heart of Gangnam. Tall white gates opened onto a long driveway lined with carefully trimmed trees. The house itself looked more like a private resort than a residence, with glass walls, marble floors, and an enormous garden behind it. Sara had never seen anything like it. Her duties began immediately. She woke up before sunrise every day to prepare the house before the family awoke. She polished floors until they reflected light like mirrors. She dusted expensive artwork and carefully arranged furniture that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. Despite the long hours, Sara didn't complain. For the first time in months, she had a warm bed and regular meals. She told herself she was lucky. But then she met Yuna Park. Yuna was the only daughter of Chairman Park, and she had grown up surrounded by wealth and privilege. At 24, she was beautiful in a way that drew attention everywhere she went. long dark hair, flawless skin, and designer clothes that changed every day. But there was something cold behind her smile. The first time Sarah greeted her, Yuna barely glanced at her. "You're the new maid?" she said lazily while scrolling through her phone. "Yes, miss." "Don't touch anything on my vanity table," Yuna said without looking up. "Those items cost more than your yearly salary." Sarah quickly bowed. "I understand." For several weeks, everything remained calm. Sarah worked quietly and avoided drawing attention to herself. She cleaned Yuna's room when instructed, making sure to follow every rule exactly as she had been told. But then, one rainy afternoon, something happened that would change her life forever. Sarah entered Yuna's bedroom while the house was quiet. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows as she wiped dust from the shelves and straightened the bed. When she reached the vanity table, she noticed a diamond necklace resting beside a bottle of perfume. It glittered under the soft light of the chandelier. Sarah carefully wiped the surface of the table, but as she moved the cloth, her sleeve brushed the necklace. It slipped. The delicate chain slid across the table and fell to the floor. Sora gasped. Her heart pounded as she quickly picked it up and placed it back exactly where it had been. "I was wondering how long it would take." The voice behind her made her freeze. Yuna stood in the doorway. Her arms were crossed as she watched Sora with sharp, calculating eyes. I'm sorry, miss," Sora stammered. "It fell by accident." Yuna walked slowly into the room, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "You touched it?" "Yes, but only because—" "Because you wanted to see how it felt?" Yuna interrupted. Sora shook her head quickly. "No, miss, I only picked it up." Yuna stared at her for a moment before a small smile appeared on her lips. "Interesting." Then she turned and walked away. Sora stood there trembling, but after a few minutes, she convinced herself that nothing would come from the incident. She was wrong. 2 nights later, the mansion exploded into chaos. Voices echoed through the hallways as security guards rushed from room to room. All the household staff were gathered in the living room under the watchful eyes of Chairman Park. His expression was furious. "Someone stole my daughter's necklace," he said coldly. The room fell silent. Then Yuna stepped forward. "I know who took it." Her finger slowly pointed towards Sora. The world seemed to stop. Sora felt her chest tighten. "Miss, I didn't." "She touched my jewelry earlier this week," Yuna said calmly. Chairman Park frowned. "Search her room." Sora shook her head desperately. "Please, sir, I didn't take anything." But no one listened. Minutes later, a guard returned, holding a small velvet pouch. Inside it lay the diamond necklace. Gasps filled the room. Sora stared at it in horror. "That's impossible," she whispered. Chairman Park's face hardened. "Call the police." Within an hour, Sora was sitting in the back of a police car, her wrists locked in cold metal handcuffs. The lights of Seoul blurred past the window as tears streamed silently down her face. The trial lasted less than a week. Yuna testified calmly, explaining how she had seen Sora touching the necklace days earlier. The security guard confirmed that the jewelry had been found in Sora's room. No one believed Sora's protests. The judge delivered the verdict in a voice that felt distant and unreal. 3 years in prison for theft. When the guards led her away, Sora turned back once. Yuna was sitting in the courtroom gallery. She was smiling. Prison was worse than Sora had imagined. The first night, the heavy metal door slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed through the corridor like a final sentence. Her cell was small and dim, with peeling paint on the walls and a narrow bed that felt like stone. The other inmates quickly noticed her quiet nature. Weakness didn't survive long in prison. On her third day, someone shoved her in the cafeteria line. "Move faster, thief," a woman sneered. Another inmate laughed. "You stole from rich people? That's brave." Sora kept her head down, but the bullying didn't stop. One evening, in the yard, 2 inmates cornered her. "You think you're innocent," one of them said. Before Sora could respond, a fist slammed into her stomach. Pain exploded through her body as she collapsed to the ground. The guards watched from a distance, without intervening. Nights were the worst. The lights dimmed but never fully turned off, leaving the cells bathed in a dull yellow glow. Sora lay awake on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling while tears slid silently into her hair. Sometimes she whispered her parents' names into the darkness. Other times she simply cried until exhaustion dragged her into restless sleep. Food was barely edible. Watery soup, dry rice, and sometimes nothing more than stale bread. Her body grew thinner each month. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Her hands became rough and cracked from endless labor assignments. Yet somehow she endured. One day, while cleaning the prison corridor, Sora noticed a small room filled with books. The prison library. Inside were old textbooks about coding, business, and technology. She didn't know much about computers, but the idea of learning something new felt like a lifeline. From that day on, Sora spent every free moment in the library. She studied coding late into the evening, scribbling notes in a small notebook. She read about startups, investments, and entrepreneurship. Every page gave her a tiny spark of hope. Months turned into years. Slowly, the timid girl who had arrived in prison began to change. She stopped crying at night. She stopped begging other inmates to leave her alone. Instead, she focused entirely on learning, on surviving, on building a future that no one could steal again. 3 years later, the prison gates opened. Sora stepped outside into the sunlight. She looked thinner, older, and far more serious than the girl who had once arrived in Seoul with a backpack. But her eyes had changed. They were no longer filled with fear. They burned with determination. Life after prison wasn't easy. Most employers refused to hire someone with a criminal record. So Sora turned to the one skill she had built behind bars: programming. She worked freelance coding jobs online, sometimes staying awake for 18 hours straight to finish projects. Her apartment was barely bigger than a closet. But slowly, her work began to attract attention. Clients recommended her to others. Small companies asked her to develop software tools. Investors noticed her ability to solve complex problems. Within a few years, Sora founded her own tech startup. The company grew faster than anyone expected. 10 years passed. By then, Sora's company had become one of the most promising tech firms in Seoul. She owned a sleek office building and a penthouse overlooking the Han River. But she never forgot the past. When news spread that the Park family's corporation was struggling financially, Sora quietly began buying shares, month after month, year after year, until finally she owned enough to take control. The day of the board meeting arrived. Executives filled the room, whispering nervously as Sora entered. Yoona Park sat at the table, unaware of what was about to happen. When she looked up and saw Sora, her face turned pale. "You," she whispered. Sora sat down calmly. "Let's begin the meeting." Within an hour, the documents were signed. The Park family company now belonged to her. Yoona's voice shook. "You destroyed us." Sora looked at her quietly. "No," she said. "You destroyed yourselves." Yoona stood abruptly. "Please, Sora, forgive me." The room fell silent. Sora paused for a moment. Then she stood and walked toward the door. Without looking back, she spoke one final word. "No." and she left the room. Sometimes life feels unfair. Sometimes good people suffer while those who hurt them seem to win. But Sora's story reminds us of something important. Pain can break a person, or it can forge them into something stronger. True strength is not about revenge or anger. It is about rising after every fall, refusing to let injustice define your future. Because in the end, the greatest victory is becoming someone no one can ever destroy again. For more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next lesson-packed video.